A full uncensored version of this video is available on our website, Armchair History TV, for free, using the code FREEHOLIDAY for 100% off of your first month. It is April 1945. Old men hunker down behind makeshift barricades in the streets of besieged Berlin. Besides them, teenage boys clutch rifles and Panzerfausts. This motley collection of old and young are serving in the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. It was part of Germany's broader effort to raise new military and paramilitary formations and desperately halt the Red Army's invasion of the Reich. Adolf Hitler called on the German people to deepen their commitment to winning the war, even when defeat appeared imminent. Hitler and his inner circle of advisors realized that by mid-1944, the Third Reich faced overwhelming odds in defense of the Reich. Time was running short to reverse their losses. Germany's strength would have to be mustered to salvage the situation. Victory meant saving the Reich from imminent destruction, and to do this, Germany moved to wage total war. Every man, woman, and child would be expected to contribute. Saving the Reich was no easy feat. The Western Allies and Soviet Union agreed to only accept Germany's unconditional surrender. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army routed the Wehrmacht, reoccupying most of the Soviet territory taken during the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. The degraded army groups on the Eastern Front struggled to offer effective resistance. In December 1944, the Soviets threatened to isolate the Baltic states and roll over the occupied territories in Poland and Czechoslovakia. On the Western Front, Allied armies broke out from the Normandy landings and swept eastward. They recaptured Paris and the Low Countries and toppled the Vichy French government. Allied forces crawled northward on the Italian peninsula too. By the end of 1944, American and British forces were poised to cross the Rhine and invade the German heartland. Taking in the bleak prospect of invasion, Hitler and the German leadership had few attractive options. Submission to inferior races was not an option. Fighting to the end was the only choice. But questions remained as to who would fight. The Führer distrusted the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. The Air Force lost at the Battle of Britain and failed to turn the fortunes of war on the Eastern Front. Worse, they had been unable to stop the strategic bombing of German cities. The army also failed. Its generals presented Hitler with catastrophic defeats. Operation Valkyrie, the plot to assassinate Hitler and seize control of the Reich, furthered Hitler's distrust of the army. Since the state apparatus could not be trusted, the answer instead lay in the very organization that had given them power, the Nazi Party. On October 18, 1944, Heinrich Himmler announced the formation of a people's militia, the Volkssturm. Hitler ordered party chancellery leader Martin Bormann to raise a militia of those aged 16 to 60, including the injured. Through local and regional party leaders, Hitler expected to raise 6 million men to reinforce the Eastern and Western fronts. He believed that militia troops would fight to protect their homes and hold out until the last man died. To further bolster the ranks, Bormann and Hitler called upon 500,000 members of the Hitler Youth. This video is censored on YouTube. If you want the full, unedited version, sign up for a completely free month over on armchairhistory.tv using code FREEHOLIDAY. There are also several other uncensored videos on our platform, like our videos on Israel-Hamas and the Yugoslav Wars. We have plenty of fully exclusive videos, like the series we're building covering the 7 Years' War, or our documentary on ISIS, and even a monthly podcast series where I answer all of your questions. There's also great guest creators featured on AHTV who make content every week, like The Front, who made a video on Kurt Gerstein, an SS officer who tried to expose the Holocaust, and History with Hilbert, who covered the brutal Japanese conquest of Burma. Don't forget to grab our mobile app too, which you can use on both iOS and Android. And join our Discord server, where I'm often available to answer questions and chat. Use code FREEHOLIDAY for a completely free month membership to armchairhistory.tv. Most older members of the Volkssturm trained for about 2 weeks on weeknights and Saturdays. The training itself was of inconsistent quality because most of their time in training was spent on military discipline rather than combat maneuvers. As for weaponry, recruits were taught to use an assortment of rifles and anti-tank weapons. The Volkssturm fell short of expectations. While the image of 6 million men under arms was undoubtedly impressive, it was never a reality. Some Germans evaded conscription, and a few party bosses, who had no stomach for fighting, shirked in their duties to assemble or lead militia recruits. The Volkssturm personnel that did fight often did so without sufficient weapons or supplies, and the Wehrmacht prioritized giving arms and ammunition to frontline army units, not the militia. In practice, the militia fell under the command of the Wehrmacht, not the party. The army had the weapons, supplies, and expertise that the Nazi Party lacked. With army leadership, they fought as infantry formations and proved combat effective. Despite the army's support, the Volkssturm struggled to hold back the tide of Allied forces from both the east and west. It is estimated that parts of the Volkssturm sustained 70 to 80% casualties. Outside the army's command, Volkssturm formations often broke when Allied armies pressured them. Many of the men and boys just wanted to go home. The German leadership prepared for occupation if the Volkssturm failed. Intelligence and security services, under the SS's supervision, would form a guerrilla resistance force called Werewolf. Originally designated Operation Werewolf in 1944, SS troopers would lead commando-style sabotage and assassination missions behind enemy lines or in recently occupied Allied territories. These werewolves would also kill any Germans collaborating with occupiers if the need arose. The first iteration of the werewolf plan fell through, as no one formed a command structure. But the idea gained a second lease on life. Joseph Goebbels crafted propaganda messages throughout 1945 to inspire the German people to join the werewolf movement. Leaning heavily into mythological imagery, violence, and revenge, the propaganda minister envisioned a resistance movement designed to invoke fear and terror in the Allies. Werewolf men and women were to blend into the population and kill occupiers. The insurgency would wear down and terrify the Allied powers. With an Allied retreat, the werewolf groups would restore the German Reich. While the Allies certainly believed that the movement might represent a real threat and were on the lookout for any potential insurgency, the werewolf movement never panned out. Aside from occasional potshots at occupying troops or the murder of German collaborators, no mass underground resistance fought the occupation. Civilians were war-weary and showed little enthusiasm to fight to the last man or woman. The Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, for their part, hoped to equip new formations with the Wunderwaffe to even the odds against numerically superior foes. The Luftwaffe rushed jet fighters into the air. Plans for stealth fighters or bombers that could evade Allied radar detection were proposed for full service. Cutting-edge technology, however, could not overcome low reserves of fuel and raw materials, or the loss of experienced pilots. Though they took heavy personnel and aircraft losses during the war, the Luftwaffe command pooled its resources to destroy American and British bomber wings stationed on airfields in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France during Operation Bodenplatte. They intended to destroy the bombers on the ground rather than in the air. In secret, night fighters, ground attack bombers, jet fighters, and propeller fighters moved into position to assault the airfields on New Year's Day, 1945. Commanders assumed correctly that the Allied pilots might be hungover from the previous night's festivities and would not expect an attack. Hundreds of German aircraft took to the skies shortly after the dawn of January 1st, 1945. They had the advantage of surprise and avoided Allied radar. They even surprised friendly anti-aircraft emplacements, some of which opened fire and brought down the vulnerable planes. As planned, Luftwaffe ground attack craft and fighters destroyed Allied bombers on the ground at some of the targeted airfields. Others, due to faulty intelligence, were empty. German losses were significant as well. For every bomber destroyed on the tarmac, Operation Bodenplatte's air forces lost equal numbers of craft and crew. The aftermath of Bodenplatte saw Luftwaffe commanders resorting to unconventional tactics. The lack of an effective bombing wing and a shortage of competent pilots to defend Germany's skies forced the Luftwaffe and its test squadron, Kampfgeschwader 200, to develop experimental systems. These included the V-1 flying bombs, manned suicide rocket planes like the Fieseler Fi-103R, and planned ramming gliders, among many other projects. Technical problems and the destruction of manufacturing facilities prevented most test aircraft from reaching mass production. Consistent waves of Allied air attacks was another problem. Thousands of bombers engaged in raids against German cities. Anger over Allied strategic bombing fueled a desire for revenge and inspired undertrained pilots to volunteer for doomed one-way attack missions. Starting in 1945, the Luftwaffe employed aerial ramming as an intentional tactic against long-range bombers. A task force called Sonderkommando Elbe undertook such a mission. Unable to destroy the bombers on the ground or in the air, the Luftwaffe collected a group of some 120 Bf-109s. On April 7, 1945, the task force engaged an oncoming wave of American B-17 and B-24 bombers. Instead of trying to take down the bombers with machine guns or cannons, the German fighters rammed and destroyed 22 aircraft. The ramming tactic had been theorized months before the mission, and the Luftwaffe planned on using steel-reinforced rocket gliders to ram enemy planes. The gliders never made it into full production, and the remaining option was to use conventional fighters. Though encouraged to jump out of the aircraft and parachute to safety, most German pilots died en route. The task force downed 13 bombers while losing 53 of theirs. The Allies still controlled the skies over Germany, and the bomber wings continued their raids. This would not be the only suicidal air attack force the Luftwaffe deployed. In 1944, the Leonidas Squadron solicited volunteers to fly the human-guided rocket-propelled flying bombs. The technological complexity and the potential loss of pilots forced the Luftwaffe to disband the unit during that same year. Months later, in 1945, the desperate situation during the Battle of Berlin, however, revived the Leonidas Squadron. But by this point, the pilots were left with barely any resources, only leaving them access to what little aircraft was left, and with only enough fuel for a one-way trip to attack enemy forces. From April 17th to April 20th, 1945, the pilots of the Leonidas Squadron dove their planes headlong into the bridges over the Oder River to deny the Red Army's passage. Their kamikaze-style attacks ended when the Red Army seized the airfield from which the squadron had taken off. German command claimed the squadron destroyed 17 bridges, though other sources indicated that the effort destroyed one bridge. For its part, the Kriegsmarine in 1945 was severely degraded, but improved U-boats and small unit tactics promised to take the fight to the Allied naval forces. Under Karl Donitz's supervision, the Kriegsmarine hurried the production of the Elektrobude. Designed and first constructed in 1943, these U-boats used a hybrid diesel-electric motor system and a snorkel that allowed them to remain underwater for far longer than previous models. They were designed to fight submerged. It allowed them to more efficiently evade Allied air attacks and anti-submarine warfare ships. Donitz hoped to repeat the successes of the early phases of the war, cripple the Allied supply lines, and force the invasion armies to a halt. Though advanced in design, the Kriegsmarine did not launch enough of these U-boat variants to make much of a difference so late in the war. With most of the surface fleet defeated or tied up supporting the Wehrmacht's fighting retreat in the Baltic states, the Navy resorted to commando units. Known as the K-Verband, these small units employed explosive speedboats, divers, and mini-submarines. These Navy men were to be an elite force, using highly motivated and trained personnel and experimental weapons to undertake high-risk missions. Their first major action was in 1944, where K-Verband units were deployed to blunt the Allied landings at Anzio, Italy, using diver-driven torpedoes. By 1945, the K-Verband consisted of flotillas of mini-submarine and speedy explosive-tipped motorboats that attempted to ambush Allied supply and smaller warships in the English Channel, North Sea, and Baltic Sea. Despite the daring and bravery of the small attack craft's crew, they found only occasional victories. Their mini-subs and manner torpedoes suffered constant mechanical problems. Poor weather, rough sea conditions, well-armed and armored Allied warships, and air attacks blunted the K-Verband's effectiveness. K-Verband's personnel were more likely to lose their lives in poor weather or sea conditions than to enemy ships or planes. The K-Verband's sabotage, engineering, and diving components assisted the German armed forces' defense by demolishing bridges underwater on both the eastern and western fronts. Those units destroyed some of the bridges they were tasked with, but often suffered equipment failures and heavy casualties. Their efforts, though brave, did little to stop the Allied army's invasion into the Reich. Germany's last-ditch units, at times, demonstrated the commitment and ingenuity of its armed forces. However, fanaticism and new weapons was not enough to turn back the tide of Allied and Soviet armies swarming into the Reich. Rather, the Volkssturm and Werewolf movement proved how Hitler and his cohorts were willing to risk the lives of their citizens for a deluded notion of victory that would never come. Don't forget to check out armchairhistory.tv using the discount code FREEHOLIDAY for a month completely for free. We have hundreds of videos on our platform and new content comes out every single week.